Welcome to the last session of our Ringvorlesung for this year. And I'm very glad we could get Andrew Halus, the public affairs officer for the U.S. Consulate General in Frankfurt, for today's presentation. Mind you, he's brought at least half his team, that are going to watch him to make sure that he doesn't give away any secrets or tell us anything he's not supposed to, probably. But what they usually do is they all advance U.S. foreign policy and interests through educational, cultural, and press programs. I guess we are an educational program here today. But there's also a cultural program, as you can see from the backdrop, which isn't really a backdrop. It's actually a proscenium painting from a show that he was in, because he was a theater student. And maybe he'll give us a larger idea of his, a more encompassing idea of what his place looks like. Now your image is frozen. I hope it doesn't stay that way for the rest of the show. You are invited to guess how old he is. I was wrong by about 10 years, at least from the looks of it, even though I know more about him at the moment still than you do. And a tip, he must be older than he looks, because hailing from Pennsylvania originally, he joined the Foreign Service in 2006. And Frankfurt, I guess, is one of the more boring assignments on the list, given other places that he's been to, among which are Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Erbil, Iraq. That for sure was probably also the most dangerous place that he's been to. Except for possibly Washington for 2 years in 2011 to, when was that? 11 to 13. Yep. And then Casablanca, Morocco. And from there to Frankfurt, Germany. So he'll probably tell us where he's going to go next, if this is always sort of 2 year, 3 year assignments, but probably helps if everybody else shuts down their cameras and their microphones. I will do that in a minute myself, except when we get into the question and answer period, which will be rather soon, he tells me, because then he wants to see who he's talking to. So please lift up your hands. This is a Zoom meeting, so you can do that in the sidebar function.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry that I had that initial technical hiccup, but now I'm here. I'm set up on my iPhone, so if you see it kind of go a little sheath, it's because it's sliding down my screen, so don't worry about it. All things are okay. So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am the public affairs officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Frankfurt. Here in Germany, we have an embassy in Berlin, and then we have 5 consulate generals throughout all of Germany. So we have Frankfurt, Munich, Leipzig, Hamburg, and Düsseldorf. Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on today, but anyway, I'm back on my mobile phone, so that I hope that works better than my Wi-Fi connection. So I think I cut out at the point where I was saying that my first assignment was in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, at the embassy. I was the deputy spokesperson there. And then my next assignment was in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, as a vice consul. Every foreign service officer has to do their visa assignment. So we do non-immigrant visas for people that want to go to the States for a temporary period of time, students, visitors, business people. Immigrant visas for those who intend to go to the United States and make their life there. So partners of American citizens, parents of American citizens, children of American citizens, and those who are immigrating. Others that immigrating through other means. Can you hear me now? Okay. And then my next assignment after Tanzania was I went back to Washington to our headquarters in the State Department. And I was the deputy spokesperson for all the Middle East and North Africa. So the area that I covered was from Morocco all the way over to Iran. So working with the Arabic language channels, the Hebrew language channels, the Persian language channels, and the French news channels in that region. And then after that, I went on to become the cultural affairs officer in our consulate general in Erbil, which is in the Iraqi Kurdistan region in Iraq. And then after that, I became the public affairs officer and the head of our American Cultural Center, Dar America, in Casablanca, Morocco. And then I was lucky enough to come here to Consul General Frankfurt. And so my specialty is public diplomacy. And so what I do is I work a lot with understanding young audiences, trying to make our policy or explain our policies in a way that can be understood by university and high school students. And that doesn't mean that we dilute it. It means that we talk to them in the channels that they want to be talked to, through virtual engagements, going into classrooms, through exchange programs, through social media, as opposed to more traditional means, which is some more traditional audiences would want maybe the newspaper, which younger audiences may not be focused on. So those types of things. And so I do a lot of work on the exchange programs, on getting people to study in the United States through Education USA. And that's, if anyone has questions about studying in the US, I'll be more than happy to answer those questions. I also do a lot with media work. So I work with all of the media outlets in our four states, so Hessen, Baden-Württemberg, Rheinland-Pfalz, and Saarland. And we work a lot with the ministries of education, ministries of the international cooperation ministries in the 4 states as well. And, you know, with civil society. So we work a lot with Bildungsstätte Anne Frank here in Frankfurt. We work a lot with museums all throughout the consular district. So how we can build those connections, how we can get American artists to here in Germany, how we can get German artists to the United States, American and German scholars to change places. Like I said before, students, and just really civil society leaders, so that they can go back and forth between the two countries and get to understand the transatlantic relationship a little bit better. So, you know, that's my job, and my favorite part of my job is, you know, opening myself up to y'all's questions. So with that, I am ready to take anyone's questions that you all may have. And do not be shy or scared about asking tough questions. I love them.
So Jennifer Howard has a question.
Great.
Just put on your microphone in your video and then you can ask. Okay, great. So yeah, I am just curious how many languages one has to speak to have your job.
That's great. And that's a great question. Actually, you don't have to have any languages to become a U.S. diplomat. Our diplomatic corps is very different than some of the other ones, maybe in Europe and in other countries I've lived through. There is no specific track that leads to the U.S. Foreign Service. So actually, the criteria is that one has to have at least completed their high school degree. So not even university, but a high school degree, and they have to pass the written and then the oral assessment, and then from there they go into an orientation course, and we do a crash course in how to be a U.S. diplomat, and then we go do some language training depending on where you're going, and then you go to your first assignment, and a lot of it's on the job training, which is very different than the models I know about here in Germany and Austria and in Morocco and Saudi Arabia, where people are really trained from university on to enter this course of foreign service or diplomacy. Ours is a very different model. Very often people come to the foreign service as a second career. There's a lot of lawyers, business people that kind of come to the foreign service. I studied acting and political science and German, so there's no traditional path into the foreign service. Now, there are some languages, as someone knows them, some of the really critical, hard languages that we need in our diplomatic corps, that if you know them, you get some bonus points on your original interviews. So those languages are like Arabic, Chinese, Russian, Farsi, those kind of languages that are really hard to find. So if you speak those languages at a certain level, you get a little bonus point when you apply. But for my first assignment from Saudi Arabia, the Foreign Service Institute, our academy, they taught me Arabic. And then my next assignment, when I went to Tanzania, they taught me Swahili. And then I continued to use my Arabic in Iraq, although it really was Kurdish, but it could be understood with English and Arabic. And then in Morocco, I learned French. And here, I'm a heritage speaker of German. My father was born in Austria, in Salzburg, in Bundesland Salzburg, so a little south of Salzburg in Bischofshofen. And so I was exposed to German when I was little. And then I did an exchange program. In 1998 to 1999, I was on the Rotary Youth Exchange Program for my junior and senior year of high school. And I studied in Vienna, a little bit outside of Vienna, in a small town, Biedermannsdorf, in Lower Austria. And I stayed with 2 host families. And the most amazing thing is that was 21 years ago. And I still see them every year. I was married last May 2019, and they came to the wedding, all of them. So I can't speak highly enough about how important exchange programs are in building up those connections between people and helping each other understand each other better. And we disagree about things, but we do it as friends and family. And so that's really good because you keep that dialogue open even when you disagree about things.
I have follow-up questions, but I don't want to dominate the questioning. So just stop me, Professor, or anybody who wants me to shut up. But my follow-up question is 2 parts. One, what do you see your role, the different roles that you've had in the different countries that you served in? What do you see is the red line that connects all of them? What's the similarities in your job? Like, does it feel like you're working at is your job like a franchise of the U.S. government and it's the same wherever you go, like if you worked at Starbucks, for example? Or is it totally different? That's part one. And the second part is, what do you think your most meaningful impact is in this job?
Great. I think it's the first time I've ever heard my job compared to Starbucks, and I love it. I love that comparison. Because yes, no matter where we are in the world, I could work in China, I could work in South Africa, I could work in Brazil. And our number one priority is to advance the interests of the United States, to advance the foreign policy and economic interests of the United States, to promote American values, and to protect American citizens. Those are our core values of the Foreign Service. So everything that we do is designed to meet those goals. So now, how you actually implement those goals in different countries is very different. But those are our core goals, and that's our guide. That's our guidepost for every assignment. And so, you really do have like protection of American citizens. Here in Germany, maybe not such a big deal because the police force here is reliable and honest and trustworthy, and the laws are easy to follow, those types of things. Protecting American citizens in countries where the laws are a little more ambiguous, where the cultural norms are a bit different than ours, that can become a little bit different. And so, like in Saudi Arabia, we had a lot of cases because children are under the protection of the mother for the first 5 years in Saudi Arabia, and then after 5 years, they become under the protection of the father. So if the mother and the children were being abused by the father, and the mother fled with the children, and she was an American citizen, she was not allowed to leave Saudi Arabia with those children. So and those children are American citizens because they're born of an American citizen mother. So how do we protect the rights of those children if they're in an abusive relationship, but the domestic laws of the country they're living doesn't allow us for the mother to take custody of them and bring them out of the country? So that's really where the hard diplomacy comes into play. And also, of course, there's always different regional aspects at play. Advancing America's interests change where we are. In Saudi Arabia, it was really about seeking Middle East peace and using Saudi as a means as a voice in the region to kind of promote those values if possible. And in Morocco, protecting American values was creating a business environment that was open and hospitable to American investment, and pushing back against some of the counter investors in that region, like Russia and China, that we viewed were against the values of the United States and Morocco and the EU. So really trying to how we figure out those very interesting balancing acts and advance those priorities. But our goal as a diplomat is very clear. We are here to advance America's interests. And as far as those intersect with our host government, which they often do, because we find ways to do that, if there's ever a conflict, it is America's interest that we're advancing because we are American diplomats. I think I saw another question from somebody. I think, Hannah, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, my question would be in how far your job has been affected by changing policies or political decisions, or especially during the Trump presidency or now with the change of president. Is it something that really changes your day-to-day work, or is it too far away?
So, we are U.S. diplomats, like I said. So we represent the policy of the president, the president who is sitting, who's in power, no matter when it is. I've served under President Bush, I've served under President Obama, and I've served under President Trump. And I will serve, as long as I'm in the Foreign Service, any other president that's elected by the American people. When we look at Germany as a small example of the global policies, what you see is that our policies in Germany have remained consistent for a very long time. NATO, viewing NATO as the bedrock of transatlantic partnership and mutual our defense strategy in Europe and globally, that has not changed. That's always been our bedrock. Asking countries, or really demanding that countries adhere to the Wales Accord, and that they do commit 2% of their GDP to their interoperability within NATO, so that their militaries can work well with other NATO militaries. That's a key priority that has remained consistent as long as I've been a diplomat. Other key things are always advancing and advocating for America's business interests. Whether it means that we are providing a counterbalance to Russian domination in the energy field, like what could happen with Nord Stream 2, and reminding the Germans that it's in their best interest to have a diversified energy capacity, will always be part of our priorities. And that's all part of creating space for American businesses and American investment in Germany, and also German investment in the United States. And then, we also look, and on the broader scope of things, is also looking at the idea of countering gauging the threat perception in Germany of Russia and China. How the Germans, and helping Germans really understand that our values as NATO allies, our value as transatlantic partners, our values are much closer aligned than the values of Russia and China. And we understand that Germany is a global leader and that Germany has to play on the global stage, and they have to have relationships with Russia and China and the United States. But we always are constantly reminding Germans and our colleagues and our partners that they have to always also make the assessment of values. And when they're looking at values, we are more closely linked than the values of the Russians and the Chinese as far as international actions and what we do in the world together.
Can I ask you, how does this advising work? So how often are you in contact with MPs from Germany, or how does it work? Yeah.
So the members of parliament or members of Bundestag, I'm a public diplomacy officer, so my focus is not on what we call established leaders. So established leaders are the members of the Bundestag, people in the Staatskanzlei, those types of people. My focus is really working with emerging voices. So young people like yourselves, with young college students, high school students, people that don't have people that may be underrepresented. So new immigrants to Germany, underrepresented communities, whether it be religious minorities or racial minorities, and helping and trying to understand how they feel. And the reason why I love doing these sessions with students is because your questions And the things that you ask me, that tells me what you think is important, right? And so that's why I really, really love the questions that I get from students, because you all keep me honest. And then I can let people know, like, this is what students are really thinking. These are the issues that are important to young Germans. And if we want to keep our relationship alive and healthy and really vibrant, we need to start listening to what young people are thinking, and what they say as well. And I will also say, if anyone doesn't like an answer of mine, push back, argue with me. I love it. I love to hear your opinions. I really do.
All right, thanks. Jennifer has another question, I think.
I sure do. What do you see, do you see at all any impact from the polarization that is happening in the US between people? Does that have any effect on how you do your job? Does that get in the way at all? Does it distract from your project? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, but I think that the polarization is also a global trend. I think we're seeing it all over. I think we're seeing it in Germany as well. We're seeing it through a lot of EU countries. But I would say that, we do feel it as diplomats. We do feel that, for example, we're in the middle of a budget talk right now, right? The US budget, the fiscal year ends every year on September 30th, and the new budget year starts on October 1st. Ideally, Congress should have a passed budget by October 1st, so the government is funded throughout the entire year. I can't remember the last time we've had a full year budget passed because of these types of things. One year it was about, in 2018, it was because the Democrats did not want to fund President Trump's border wall. And President Trump said very clearly, this is a priority for me. I promised the voters I would do this. I'm not budging. And so we had a government shutdown for a month. Tomorrow, what we call the continuing resolution, so a mini budget, was passed at the end of September that would continue until December 11th. And that is set to run out tomorrow, but they're working to do a 1-week extension, so they have more time to negotiate to do a further continuing resolution or a further budget. So that's where we really feel the polarization is in the budget process. And that makes it really hard for us to plan strategically, because if we don't have the strategic financing, we can't plan strategically, because we ideally need to be able to spend our money all year. And this is not a single party. Both parties have responsibility for passing a budget. And so when there is a stalemate, there is responsibility on both parties. And that, so it does impact us, those, not just foreign service officers or diplomats, but everyone in the government. Because in 2018, we had a shutdown where people were not getting paid until the budget was passed. They were sent home. And some people were also had to work, but weren't getting paid for it. So, and then of course we all got paid afterwards, but during that period of time, and it can be, some people can make it very tight. They can become, financially it can become very tight and very difficult, which is unique, because I don't think that happens here in Germany. But I see 2 other hands.
Yeah, I don't know. Hi. I don't know who's up first, but I guess I'll just take the mic.
Great. Our first guy.
I have 2 questions. They're both reactions to comments you've made.
Great.
One is short and quick, so I'll say that first. It's just you mentioned American values, and I wanted to know what American values you promote, other than business interest. And the other question, I hope I can formulate in a comprehensible way, and it may be a bit provocative. It's a reaction to you serving a president, and serving, under different administrations, of course. And to formulate it provocatively, to what extent do you think U.S. diplomats are simply legal puppets? In Germany, for instance, civil servants have a certain amount of limitation to what they can do due to kind of contractual loyalty to the state, in a way. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if there are similar setups for U.S. diplomats as well, and to what extent you kind of just have to passively go with the flow, Or, for instance, you mentioned NATO as a kind of staple over the past decades and administrations. But even under Trump, I mean, or not even under Trump, there was some, at least to the public, deep questioning of NATO. And at times there was concern about somehow trying to reestablish the relations with NATO. And I wonder if that would be something where you personally or the agency of U.S. diplomats or foreign servants could state their opinions or their experience there. I wonder what kind of leeway you have in such talks.
Sure. Those are great questions. And so I'll answer the first one first. So the values that we promote are, of course, democracy, rule of law, democracy, rule of law, and those are really the values that we promote around the world. Free economy, and so those are really the values that we're looking at pushing. Freedom, economic freedom as well. So those are the values that we're pushing around the world and really advancing. Those are our key advancements, our key areas of our key objective areas. And then, so the idea about the what's our role in? So how I would say is that every diplomat, we do not serve under duress, right? If any diplomat decides I cannot do this job anymore, we have the opportunity and also the responsibility to say, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to leave the Foreign Service, right? That's our job as diplomats, and that's a job that we do for ourselves. We have an obligation to advance the agenda of the president, who is the elected president at the time. And there's always things, we always look beyond the rhetoric and then what's actually happening on the ground, because the rhetoric is meant for many different audiences. There's sometimes where a president is saying something about something, but he's really talking to the American audience and not to the European audience, or not to the foreign audience, right? So, and now, because of the way communications are done, there's no longer that way to divide the line. Before, in the 70s and the 80s and before, even in the 90s, the president had domestic outlets that he could say something to. And then when he wanted to speak to foreign outlets, he went to a foreign outlet. And there was that dividing line. Now that dividing line no longer exists, especially with social media. So all audiences hear all messages. But there's definitely times when a president is messaging to one audience over another. And that's something every president does. So what we look for is looking at the relationship level. So even if there's a time where there may be more tensions in NATO or more tensions in a bilateral relationship, we look at the relationship level and we say, how do we keep this going to get over these tensions while still being faithful to the policies of the president? And one of those things can be, meeting with people as a contact, having people over for dinner, keeping that dialogue going, engaging with students and answering the tough questions from students about how do you do this type of thing. So it is an interesting balancing act because, we all have our own compass, our own moral compass that guides us. And we all have to kind of look at those ideas and see, how can I be helpful here? How can I not be helpful here? And can I do this? And I have had friends that have left in different administrations, the Foreign Service, and I haven't. I've decided to stay because I think the role that I play can be very helpful across all administrations, because I do like listening to people, and I think that even when there is difficult relationships, we can always listen to understand where people are coming from. Thank you for that question. Awesome.
Hi, I think I'm supposed to go next because I raised my hand in the chat. My question kind of goes off on in the same direction as the person before me, because I was wondering, when you talked about economic freedom and democracy and all that. I mean, those are kind of the very the values that basically everyone, at least in name, connects to the United States. But I have to say I have a way more critical perspective of the United States as an economical and also militaristic imperial power. And I was just wondering how because I was trying to imagine like how I could square, because I think like at least what it sounds like, what you do for work sounds very interesting, but I don't know if I could like square that with my moral compass, as you said, to know that I would have to promote a positive image of a country that has very like problematic roles in the world, the past and present.
So I would agree that there's definitely the assessment out there that there's been problematic things with U.S. foreign policy in the past, and I think that could be a fair assessment especially for someone from Germany to make that assessment. I would say that overwhelmingly the U.S. is a force for good. Does it mean that we've never made mistakes? Does it mean that we've never started a problem? No, that would be lying. But we are overwhelmingly a force for good. I think that the things that we've done in the world definitively have been a force for good. The Marshall Plan, developing of Europe, decimated Europe after World War II. Europe would not be where it is if the U.S. had not been a force for good. And that was only 70 years ago. That's pretty recent. PEPFAR. The U.S. through its efforts have completely eliminated the rapid growth of AIDS, HIV in Africa because of our investment in PEPFAR, our investment in the presidential initiative to end AIDS and HIV, and that started under President Bush. And that's something that no one in the world was focusing on, and that was something that was decimating the population of Europe, of Africa. I worked in Tanzania, where the AIDS infection rate was about 20% of adults. And by the time I left Tanzania in 2011, the new infection rate was below 5%. So if that's not a force for good, I don't know what is. And then also the idea of how we've also almost eradicated malaria around the world as well, with our efforts through that malaria-free world with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that we help support. So I think that there's a lot of things that we can always have the debate about mistakes, and that's a very honest debate to have. But on the balance, the U.S. is definitely a force for good. I believe that, or I would not be a U.S. diplomat.
I guess if I may, I'd just follow up on that just once to keep it short.
Sure.
I think we could get into a pretty big discussion. But I was just thinking, sure, we could kind of like weigh the positives and the negatives, but we would have to do a lot of weighing on both sides, I would say. And I would agree definitely that for Europe, especially.
I wouldn't agree. I think the positive side would definitely outweigh the negative side. So I would not agree with that assessment.
All right. I think like for Europe, probably I would agree that for Europe, the US has been a very positive force. But I was like, when I was thinking about that, I was more thinking about not just the mistakes and like in terms of starting an illegal war in Iraq, for example, but also things like, things that are at the very basis of apparently also your mission, or what you understand to be your mission, being economic freedoms, and the way the US and the modern kind of neoliberal economic policies frame economic freedom, being this neoliberal agenda that has cost thousands of lives in many different countries, starting in Chile with illegal coups and toppling regimes, and all that through South America and the Middle East. It just felt like, yeah, sure, you could get all these positive assessments, but also I feel like this negative one is kind of, or this negative aspect is kind of at the center of what you seem to be promoting too, being this like, because I feel like economic freedom is kind of a catchphrase. It can mean a lot, but it's like, what does it actually mean? That's kind of, that was just not really a question, but kind of a pushback, I guess, because you asked for it.
What I would say is that I think the global reality of the 50s is definitely different than the global reality today, right? The global reality of the 50s was a bipolar world. And so it was very much defined in countering communism. And the US policy at that time was that we were going to do everything to prevent the spread of communism. And that definitely resulted in things that were unsavory, but we were very clear about our objectives with that. And we should be careful about going too far back into history to look at examples of countries and their actions. So what I would say is that looking at modern times, I think that we can talk about the war in Iraq. That's certainly an issue that I get asked about a lot in talks with students. And I would say, you know, we've been pretty honest about it, that we made a mistake in Iraq. We've said that very clearly. And the thing that we haven't done is, although we've withdrawn, we still remain incredibly invested in Iraq to try to work to make the democracy that's there and unstable in Iraq work, to have a system of rule of law there. And we've been so successful with that the Germans have come on board after the initial action to support that agenda in Iraq as well. Because the Germans are there. The Germans are the second largest troop component in Iraq currently. So, you know, if we have to look a little bit deeper about what the objectives are in Iraq, because we would also have to criticize the German government as well, because the objectives for our two governments are the same in Iraq currently. Another question?
Yeah, thanks for answering that. I think Professor Hochburg has another question.
Yeah.
At least.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I also wanted to come to your support a bit here. I mean, I grew up with a granduncle who had served in the First World War, then had been a Free Corps member, then had been a policeman in the Weimar Republic, had been a policeman in the Third Reich, and had been, you guess, a policeman in the Bundesrepublik until he retired.
Wow.
I remember asking him whether that ever constituted any problems for him under 4 different regimes. And he said, no, they'd only been there to maintain law and order, and they didn't know anything about politics. And I said, no further questions, Your Honor. I rest my case. Yeah? And I have the feeling that, or from what I hear, the last couple of gentlemen here have sort of insinuated that serving under 4 different presidents in the US seems to equal something like what my granduncle did. And I can't say I follow that at all. In fact, even Donald Trump, who has had a very bad rap in Germany in terms of media reporting, has always stayed within the limits of the US Constitution, at least until, well, pretty much most recently. I think he's currently going beyond it, but that's a different story, and we have a president-elect already in the starting blocks. So it's one of the nice things about the US that they stay pretty much the same and are relatively reliable as a partner and as a friend in the Western world. And if you think that the situation at the moment is politically or militarily unbearable, you should have been around in the 1970s in the Cold War, when I was there, and we served alongside American forces in that war. Anyway, a question that I have, or 2 questions really. One, I'd like to hear more about the deployment to Erbil, because I mean that was probably not only metaphorically a minefield that you were in there at the time, also between the Iraqi government and the relatively autonomous Kurdish part of the country. So a lot of probably difficult situations to maintain a balance in. One, and the other one, more obviously, what do you expect from the Biden administration? I must admit, I'm not even sure if we do have an ambassador from the US at the moment. I only noticed when the last one left, and I did not particularly sort of weep bitter tears after him, I must admit that. Yeah, what's going to come? What was it like in Erbil, and what's going to come next?
Well, I would thank you for your questions, and I would say that my assessment of what, and I think your name is Tillman and Ben. was definitely not that. My assessment was a really good question about how do I, as a person with my moral compass guiding me, allow me to work across so many different political spectrums. And I answered that by saying that I do think that on a whole, the U.S. is a force for good. And I also think what's important to remember is that although I was alive during the end of the Cold War, young people now who are under 30 years old, they have a very different reality, right? I mean, young people grew up with September 11th, 2001. And since that point in time, young people, the fact on the ground is that young people have seen the U.S. as a force that has had a permanent military presence in 2 countries around the world, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think it's a very fair assessment that young people that only see the U.S. in that scope, that they are more critical of the U.S. because they didn't live through the Marshall Plan. They didn't live through the U.S. during the Cold War. And we've pulled back a little bit from Europe on the military side, and we've moved our focus towards other places. So I think it's a very fair assessment to ask those questions, and I appreciate them because that's what I'm here for, is to ask those questions and to understand what's important to young people. And I think that that's a really key assessment for us to understand, that people that are under 25 or under 30 don't have those flashbulb memories of the end of the Second World War, the Marshall Plan, and the Cold War. That's history to them. And that's history for you all, this audience. That's not your contemporary existence. And so I completely understand how you see the U.S. in a lens very differently than maybe I do, or a professor or someone that's in an older generation does. And so I really do appreciate your questions on those fronts, and those tough questions. For working in Erbil was fascinating. As you mentioned, there was that constant push and pull between the federal government in Baghdad and the autonomous government in Erbil in the Iraqi Kurdistan region. There was a lot of tension there, especially when it came to budget kickbacks, because the budget had to be centralized in Baghdad, and then Baghdad was mandated by the constitution to give money back to the Iraqi Kurdistan region, which didn't always come back quickly or come back at all. So that was a huge point of tension. And it was also the relationship. The U.S., particularly the U.S. military and the diplomatic corps, have a strong relationship with the Iraqi Kurds. They viewed the U.S. as their protector. They viewed the U.S. as their ally in their fights against Saddam Hussein. So there was a very different type of feeling in the Kurdistan region than there was in the rest of Iraq. It was very welcoming. They saw us as constructive partners. The Iraqi Kurdistan region, so you're talking about perspective, definitely saw the war in 2003 as a war of liberation for the Kurds, whereas other parts of Iraq could have seen it differently. Kurds definitely saw it as a war of liberation, and they welcomed it, and they did fight on side of U.S. and the other coalition partners. The work there was particularly fascinating because I was the cultural affairs officer, so I was working with exchange programs, getting more Iraqis, particularly Kurdish Iraqis, to study in the U.S., getting more Americans to come and do programs in Kurdistan. So that was really fascinating because it was one of the few places that we could actually do those exchange programs. The rest of Iraq, we could not. It was a really rewarding experience. It was the end of it was actually quite traumatic. If people remember correctly, in the summer of 2014, what was happening is that ISIS was taking over large swaths of land from Iraq. And they got as far as Kirkuk and as close to the border, even closer to the border. And so at one point, ISIS forces were about 15, 20 kilometers away from where I was living. So it was tremendously stressful. We actually a lot of people were evacuated, and I was one of the few people that stayed behind. So that was a very interesting situation, and probably the most stressful situation I was in. And we were also at the same time receiving a huge amount of internally displaced people, which are people that are forced to leave their part of the country and move to another part of their sovereign country. And the people that were being forced to leave were Christians from Mosul, Shia from Mosul. Yazidi people were summarily killed by ISIS. And they were all seeking refugee status or internally displaced status in Iraqi Kurdistan, so in Erbil and those towns around there. and visiting those camps of people that really just had to flee with what they had in their car or on their back was really traumatic for them. And then also the Yazidis were stuck on top of a mountain, if I remember correctly, Sinjar Mountain, where they were held up because all the roads to leave that mountain were being held by ISIS. And they were literally, if they left the mountain, they'd be shot by ISIS forces. And so we were looking at ways about how we could rescue them, how we could do corridor transports to secure corridors to bring them to safer areas. So that was a really interesting part, and it really was a time that I got to see the whole of government work together. And you want to talk about the value of the U.S. military. The people who secured the rescue of those tens of thousands of Yazidis were the American military, working with their Iraqi counterparts to secure that corridor that allowed them to get off of that mountain, survive sniper fire from ISIS, and get to safety. Otherwise, an entire population of people could have been killed by ISIS. And that's something that couldn't have been done without the U.S. military being in Iraq at that time. As far as looking into a crystal ball about the Biden administration, I wouldn't want to do that because he's not our president yet. So I will let the Biden administration, his transition team, speak for themselves. They're doing a very good job at kind of explaining their policies via the media. What I will say is there are evergreen issues with Germany and the U.S. that haven't changed for decades. NATO, the 2% spending of the GDP for interoperability with the other NATO militaries, working together to counter the threat of Russia and China, like I addressed in the beginning, and then also creating more welcoming environments for, as we already have here, but just increasing the ability of Americans to invest in Germany and the EU and vice versa. Those are all things that I think will stay constant because they've been so constant and they've been the bedrock of our relationship for decades and decades. So I wouldn't want to do too much other foreshadowing into the administration, into the president-elect's administration, though. And then the ambassador topic, you're absolutely right. Ambassador Rick Grinnell departed the country last March. And, you know, there's a lot of speculation on who will become the new ambassador under President Biden. And I will let that speculation play its way out in the world and in the media. But what I will say is that we have had the most competent and amazing leadership in Mission Germany in our charge d'affaires, Robin Quinville. You will never find a more qualified diplomat to manage the relationship in Germany, the bilateral relationship, and also any number of multilateral issues we have with Germany. And our consuls general throughout the country, including ours, Pat Lucina in Frankfurt, top-notch, great, amazing leaders. So the German-American relationship is in good hands with our career diplomats. And of course, we'll welcome the new ambassador whenever he or she is appointed or confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And whenever he or she comes out here, you know, they will take over and we will work for that personal representative of the president. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks. What would you say motivates U.S.'s decision to pick their battles, both military battles and of other natures? So why, I mean, ISIS is the obvious example, I suppose, but why ISIS and not the border dispute in Armenia and Azerbaijan right now? Or why malaria in Tanzania? What motivates those decisions?
I said our foreign policy is for the advancement of U.S. interests around the world and for the advancement of democracy around the world. We never lose sight that we are here to advance the interests of the United States. And those are determined by the president. I mean, those are interests that are determined by the president and his cabinet. So why ISIS? Because ISIS was undermining the sovereign authority of Iraq, which is a country that we have key interests in. We have key political interests there. We see them as a linchpin for geopolitical security. We see them as a counterpart, the counterbalance against a stable Iraq is a good counterbalance against Iran's influences, although they do have some connections there, but it's a good counterbalance to Iran's influence. A stable Iraq is also for the interest of Middle East peace. And the global oil supply. It's incredibly important that we have a stable global oil supply throughout that region with free transport, and that supply is secure and safe and in a democracy. And why malaria in Africa? You know, sometimes we do foreign policy because it's the right thing to do. We do have key interests in East Africa and throughout all of Africa, but the eradication of a disease that was killing people unnecessarily, or not the eradication, but the reduction of spread and death, or the lethality of a disease, that's just a good policy. If people aren't dying from preventable diseases, whether it be malaria or AIDS, HIV, that means there's that many more people that are in the workforce that can support that economy to grow. And so that's just, there's just times where we just do good policy, good foreign policy because it's the right thing to do. And I think I saw Zorha was the next person. Zahra?
Yes. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello. Hi. I come from Iran. I should tell it maybe.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. I have 3-4 questions till now. And I apologize beforehand if my questions seem so crude, or and please correct me if I'm wrong. Because you mentioned about Iraq, that the war of Iraq was a mistake, and what America is doing now in Iraq is like a kind of compensation. And I wanted to ask is it really with good intentions what America is doing in Iraq, and it's not interference? Mm-hmm. That is my first question.
That is absolutely not appropriate. That is a completely appropriate question. And so what I would say about that is, the intelligence that we had about what was happening in Iraq was wrong. And so the basis for the invasion has been said many times that the intelligence was not right. At this point, we believe that it's in everyone's interest if Iraq is as stable as it can be, is a democracy, has respect for minorities in Iraq, and has a prosperous economy. And so now it wouldn't be right. We went in there, we replaced a leader through a military action, and so now we have to be there and help Iraqis develop. We have to help Iraqis develop that democracy that many of them want, that the Kurds want, that other minority groups want, and they want the protection from majority groups. So I think that it's our responsibility to play a role there. And I think that it's also, Germany's also seen that, you know, in spite of our disagreements in 2003, that now this is an international issue, and it's in the interest of all of our partners in NATO to see a stable and secure Iraq. So that's the reason why we're still there. And that's the reason why I think we're going to see that there's a lot of American investment of time and resources and energy to creating that stability in Iraq until it exists. And I think you had another question, so go ahead.
Yeah, but well, you think how successful it has been, this, what you're doing in Iraq? Yeah, I'm kind of maybe repeating my question, but I just want to get sure.
Is it successful? I mean, you know, a totalitarian dictator no longer controls the lives of every person inside the country. There is, although not perfect, there is a democratically elected parliament that represents the people of Iraq. The people of Iraq, men and women, have the right to vote for their leadership. Is it perfect? Is it great? Is it the end of its process? Absolutely not. But is Iraq better as a democracy where people have the right to determine their leadership and change their leadership when they don't agree with it than they were under a totalitarian dictator? Yeah, I think they are.
Yeah, I'm asking this question because I know that Iraq, as far as I know, is also very polarized. There are people who still want a person like Saddam Hussein back, and yeah, they can't live in democracy, and some people who want democracy. And I don't know which one outweighs the others, but yeah, that's what I'm asking.
So, I mean, from our perspective, the U.S. perspective, and I won't speak for Germany, but I think that other other democracies would agree with this, is that a democracy is always better, and people have the choice of who they vote for. If we really gave power to people who wanted to have dictators in control, you know, there's voices like that in Europe that want dictators to take the control. I mean, we see that here in Germany, that there's people that want a past that shouldn't exist anymore, and they want that to take control in Germany. And we acknowledge here in Germany that those voices are wrong. So why would we support voices in other countries that say they want a dictator and be against the democratic principles that people have gone out and risked their lives to vote for? So I think that we have, as democracies, have to support the development of other democracies with all the bumps and bruises that take place in that development.
All right.
Did you have another question?
Yep. I wanted to ask about your experience with, what we are doing now, that you get in touch with youth. If you had also this experience in countries like Saudi Arabia or Iraq or so, and how different was your experience there?
Not different at all. I tell everyone gets worried about having a conversation with a journalist. And I always say, journalists are easy compared to students. You all ask the tough questions that we need to answer, and we need to be able to support our answers. But also, I think young people around the world are very interested in these topics. You brought up really good questions. When I was in Iraq, I got questions from every group that I talked to about, why did it happen? Are we better off? Do you think we're better off? If we're better off, why is there still violence? We got all these questions, and we welcome that because, you know, the young people are the ones that are going to have to find solutions, because there's still going to be problems left from the generation that's currently in power, right? The development of a democracy does not stop after the election. The development of a democracy is ongoing. The U.S. democracy is still ongoing, right? We're looking to build a more perfect union because we know we will never have a perfect democracy. And that's the same in Germany. That's the same in Iraq. And so I think that those values are the same when you have any type of young people living in a democracy. In Saudi Arabia, there's some really interesting challenges. Because of cultural norms, if I wanted to speak with female students, they had to sit behind a curtain. So that was really interesting to kind of engage with young people, but not be able to see who I was talking to. Kind of like this Zoom call where everyone has their camera turned off. I think that it creates its own unique challenges. And it's wonderful. It's really great, because I think that we have a lot of good insight into how young people think by the questions that they ask.
Right. Well, that was really interesting. And my other question may seem a bit personal, but I wanted to say, because as you also mentioned, in countries like Saudi Arabia, the values are different, the laws are different. So I wanted to say, you talked about protecting American citizens there. I wanted to ask if your own rights have been violated in any way in those countries, or your life has been in danger.
Sure. No, but I will say that we have a very interesting status when we're abroad, right? We're a U.S. diplomat. When I'm abroad, I'm a U.S. diplomat, right?
Yep.
And on top of that, I'm a white male. So there's a certain amount of privilege that comes with those two statuses anywhere in the world you go. You may be a minority, like I was in Tanzania, but you still are, people still acknowledge for some reason or another that the American diplomat and being a white male there's a certain amount of privileges that are automatically extended just because of who I am. So my existence as a diplomat is very different than my colleagues who are people of color or women of color or women. When I talk about my time in Saudi Arabia, I enjoyed it a lot. I did not feel constrained in Saudi Arabia. When I talk to my female colleagues, they say, I felt really constrained. I had a colleague, a female of color, who said that, she did not like going out by herself without other Americans because when other Americans were with her, people would acknowledge that she was an American. When other people were not with her, people would not acknowledge that she was an American. And that's not unique to Saudi Arabia. It happened in Russia. There has been a case in the United States of a female of color who was stationed in Mexico, and she would frequently go back to Texas to do shopping, and she was stopped by American border security agents who would question her Americanness and question her diplomatic passport. As an American diplomat working at our embassy in our consulate in Mexico, she was questioned by our border security agents about the validity of her passport and whether she was really American or not. So American diplomats who look differently than I have different problems around the world than I have. The one thing that I think is unique to me is that I do identify as LGBTIQ. I identify as a gay man. And so it is harder to work in some more conservative societies. My husband that I married, he lives in Madrid, but I met him when I was in Morocco. And so he would travel to Morocco, and they never any problem getting in. But, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to hold hands in Morocco. It wouldn't be appropriate for us to have a kiss in Morocco, which would be perfectly normal for opposite sex couples. So that's a constraining factor. And also here in Germany, it may surprise you, but we have been spat at here in Frankfurt by people. And we have been called really derogatory terms in German by people. So it's not unique to the Muslim world. It's also, there's a lot of people, unfortunately, in Frankfurt. And it's also happened here in the United States too. We've been called every name in the book in the States just because we're holding hands walking down the street. In Washington, D.C., so not my hometown, which is a small town, but in a big metropolis. So, there are things that we face, but not things that are different than I would back home. But, it's hard to be a same-sex couple in some more conservative societies.
Right. Thank you very much.
No, thanks for that question. That was great. Oh, I think I see Alexandria.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question too. You
Sure.
said your job as a diplomat is to protect minorities. So I wanted to know if you had a take on the actual situation in China with the Uyghurs. Do you think US will take action for that?
Yeah, so this has actually been a major issue of Secretary Pompeo, our current Secretary of State. This has been his priority. And this is actually where we see that there's a lot of overlap with the foreign policy of the United States and Germany and the EU. Because both the EU, Germany, or the EU, Germany within the EU and as Germany as a bilateral state, they view the human rights and self-determination of minorities as a key foreign policy objective. And so when people talk about how do we explain that our values, that Germany's values are more closely aligned with the U.S. than they may be with China's foreign, with the CCP's foreign agenda, because the Chinese people are the Chinese people. The CCP is the government. Just like we ask people to draw a division between the U.S. government, me, and American people as citizens, right? They're different things. And our criticism is never of Chinese people or of Iranian people or of Russian people. Our criticism is always of the government when we make a criticism. And so we view this as a key point that we can really align ourselves with the Germans on, and also a point that we think the German population is very sympathetic and understanding of. As, when you're doing business contracts with a country, and for example, if Germany would decide to put Huawei into its 5G network or other CCP-owned companies, because every company in China is 51% controlled by the CCP. And we know for a fact that Huawei has used its technology to surveil on the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. So why would Germany want to use that company and enter into a multi-billion euro contract with a company that spies on minorities in its own country? And so that's a question that we asked the German government the German and the EU governments to look at. And also, you know, when German politicians, there's members of Bundestag and the Green Party that have been prevented from traveling to China to investigate the Uyghur situation because the Chinese don't want foreign politicians to see what's going on. So that's also a thing, is that why would Germany want to have that relationship with a country that is preventing its own investigation about what's going on inside the borders of China?
Yeah, that's the point. But I think that's sort of a violation of human rights, what's going on. And I think that as a US diplomat, or just as a European or US citizen, it's important to defend those rights. I mean, it's not normal what's happening.
Absolutely not. No, I think that you would, I don't think you'd ever thought you would hear this, but I think you and Secretary Pompeo are of the same mindset in this issue. And that goes to prove how very complicated foreign policy is, right? You may not agree with Secretary Pompeo or President Trump on 99 issues, but you agree with them on this one. So that's really where we as diplomats have to find this space, right? I may say, okay, you green politician, or you Dininka, you may not support us on 95% of our agenda, but on 5% you do, and on this 5%, it's critical. Let's work together on this. Can we do that? And then you find that common ground. And so, like, there's never somebody or there's never a country that's so divergent from you that you can't find some area to work on with that person. And I think that that's what our job as diplomats, to find that space, even in the most difficult of environments.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I'm coming. Okay. So in light of the fact that this is the majority of your job, is finding these places where you can connect over shared values and shared interests, do you have thoughts on, say, boots on the ground in the U.S. with finding common ground between people? Like in the past, the U.S. has had success, a little bit of success with compromise and with finding these areas of common ground to, quote, reach across the aisle and try to continue to have a country and a shared sense of citizenship together. Post-Trump, since this is very much like what you're doing around the world, what do you foresee as the diplomatic ways people can interact among themselves in the U.S. To continue to have a country? Because this is, obviously you can tell by my accent, I am also American. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very interested, not in maybe the cheesy cliches of the past, but the practical stuff that you might learn from being a foreign diplomat, mm-hmm. of finding these areas of common ground.
I would say that there's like I said about the agreement points, I think there's very few relationships where there's nothing people agree on. And I think building up the trust within those things that you agree on. I also think that I actually had a really good point that flew out of my head. Hopefully it'll come back.
The worst.
Let me just take a minute and think about what I wanted to say.
If you want me to say more words
just ask the question okay. Again so I can rejigger my memory.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm thinking about is, okay, so you, on a daily basis, I assume you are leaning into these diplomatic skills where you're having to find areas of common ground with people, between people, and also with people. So trying to help some people find common ground with each other, as well as between you and maybe the U.S. and them. Mm-hmm. So what kind of, I don't know, what kind of ways of interacting and finding common ground do you think people can develop? I don't know. I feel like now I'm degrading my question. It's just
no. You actually, you really helped me, so I appreciate that. What I was going to say is that the term that I really, really dislike, because it is so fundamentally untrue, is when people say the U.S. is the most divided that it's ever been. A lie. A total lie. We fought a war.
Yeah.
Our Civil War. And we were more divided then. During Reconstruction after the war, we were more divided. So by really just pointing out that fact, this is not the worst it has ever been. It's not the greatest. It's not the worst. You know, just looking at common thing, you know, if it's family, what I would say is what we look forward to is I even talk to people for a value, for a campaign, we're trying to talk about common grounds in the Muslim world, and people say, well, you were raised Christian, and now you say you're agnostic, and I'm Muslim. Where's the commonality? I say, you believe your religion is a guiding principle for you on how to be a good person. That's my religion as well. We have two different religions, but we think that religion is designed to help us become a good person, or a not bad person. In my case. So there's always that little sliver, and we can reach those agreements. You can always find a space to say, okay, I can trust you on this point. And then you can go to something that's a little less comfortable, and it can be, okay, now I can build trust on this. Or things about the idea of, like, when you're working with young people, or with people in the Middle East as well, when they were talking about peace process. We were working a lot with the Kurds and the Shia and the Sunni in Iraq, and we always say things like, "What is something you all can agree on?" And I'd say, "How about the idea that you want your children to have a safe life?" Okay, how do you think we can do that? There are always values there that you can always pinpoint. I'm an optimist, so I will always believe this. So there's always something you can use as your anchor point.
And it seems like for you that trust plays a big factor in finding it in some way, something that you can bond over in terms of trust. Okay. That's really interesting. I mean, I'm thinking of, you know, in the US, there's a lot of talk about civil war. There's a lot of, so half my family is in the West Coast in Oregon. My sister's in Portland, and there's a lot of negative press on protesters in Portland saying they're trying to start riots, and a lot of press about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm thinking, practically speaking, it seems like, one, people are a little bit too interested in the idea of having their differences represented in a violent way where people are dying. And two, it seems unnecessary, but I feel like there has to be a way that these divides are crossed, and it seemed almost like a little bit of an emergency in hotspot areas. So yeah, I'm really interested in that. And again, like you said, I feel like in a way people almost want the US to be super divided so we can have a conflict, so we can have a dramatization of our disagreements without really understanding the consequence of actual war.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of I'm not saying it's not bad, but I think there's a lot of hype for the sake of making it more exciting than it may be. Now, there are problems that need to be addressed 100%, but I don't know if reports about the U.S. at civil war is the best way to go about it and the most productive and intellectually honest way of going about it.
Do you have any books or thoughts on, like, what one would read if they were interested in, like, at-home diplomacy?
I will tell you, my husband is a psychologist, and he tells me all the time, he said, if you were nearly as reasonable at home as you are in the office and talking with young people and journalists, our marriage would be so much easier. So the skills that I have working with people in foreign countries, I do not have when dealing with my husband. So I'm the last person to ask about that.
Okay, cool. Well, if you think of anything, or if your husband thinks of anything,
absolutely.
Email me. Okay.
Absolutely. And, oh, great! I see. So I think Frau Stein, how long do we have?
Usually it ends like 7:45, but we can.
Oh, perfect. That's great. Awesome. So let's go to Tillman, because I saw he had a question.
Me again, I hope with a less inflammatory question this time.
Your questions are just fine.
Right, okay.
You do not need to worry about that. Okay. I hope my answers are okay. I know they're diplomatic, but I hope that they're giving you something.
Yeah, they are. Okay. So what I was wondering about was I was thinking one of the big topics and big problems in the world, which also touches a lot on diplomacy, and also will also touch a lot on like questions of national security and all that stuff, is of course the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. How much, like in what ways, and how that impacts your work, or like in what areas your work touches on topics related to that, because there are so many topics related to that, in terms of like food shortages and wars over resources and stuff like that. So how much is that?
I'm actually really happy you brought up that point, and the reason is because do you know that I do these conversations with journalists and with established opinion leaders, people that are a little bit older, and they don't bring up this issue right now, and I think they realize because it's a tough issue for us as diplomats to talk about, because our policy is very divergent from what Germany's policy is currently. And the great thing, and that I always tell people, is that this is the issue for young people. And the reason why it's the issue is because if you're 60 or 70 or 50, the idea that there's going to be catastrophic climate change in the next 20, 30 years is, I may be dead by then. But for young people now, this is your life. This is going to impact you. It's going to impact your children directly. And it is a hugely existential question. And you're right. It is the intersection point of so many things. It's the intersection point of national security, military positioning, right? Because there's a lot of scholars that say that the next big battle is going to be over water resources. And we're seeing that. There's every country I've worked in before Germany has water scarcity. And even parts of Germany have water scarcity, right? I mean, the DDR is I think it's the 5th or 6th year of drought in the states that made up the former DDR. So, and Germany hasn't found a solution, and it's the 8th wealthiest country the top 5 wealthiest countries in the world, It's part of the G8, it's one of the top 8, and it hasn't found a solution for that. So imagine what it's going to be like when it's a continent-wide issue in Africa, a continent-wide issue or subcontinent-wide issue in the Near East. These are serious threats. The one key thing that I will always point out about President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Accords is there is a mechanism in the Paris Accords that allows every nation state to withdraw from it within the framework of that agreement. And he did employ the framework of that agreement by giving an advance notice by a year and then withdrawing. So his decision to withdraw was legal. But the other key thing is, the way to codify that is to create it as a treaty obligation in the United States. And President Obama made the choice not to pursue that option because he believed the executive order was more expeditious, was faster. And it was good, and he had no belief that the Senate would have passed the treaty. I think that people that really want to codify this in law have to find a way to make it a treaty obligation in the United States and not an executive order, or else it'll constantly be a back and forth, depending on who's in power. So that's going to be a key priority for people that really want to push forward this agenda, is to codify it in a treaty that the Senate has ratified. And that will be a hard fight, but not an impossible one. But you're absolutely right. This is the key issue that touches on so many different things. It's economic, right? I mean, it's an area of economic growth. Green energy is a huge area of growth in Germany and in the United States. But it's also a cost, because it's moving away from certain industries that have been very profitable to new industries that aren't profitable yet, because there's still research and development going on, which require a huge amount of investment before they become profitable. But we've done this before. US and Europe have done this. After the Second World War, we had to do this. Huge amount of investments. And then we got the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany of the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then we had the baby boomer generation in the States from the same type of development. And the US has always been more successful when they've taken on a challenge, invested in it, and become successful after it. So I think we're up to it to address this climate change issue. And I just think it's a matter of the political will. Anyone want a last question?
I mean, several hands are raised.
Let's go. Let's go for it.
Ben.
Go for it, Ben.
I think we should have Ben Morris first.
Ben, bist du da?
Thanks for listening again. I don't even have this question too well formulated for myself, so we'll see. It's a last-ditch effort. Where do you see the connection, and where do you see the disconnect between a government and its people? Because in some instances, you've used the voice of the people as a justification for acting with the government, because people choose this representative body. And in another statement, you've made a very clear distinction between speaking about or criticizing or working with a government and not the people. So how do those come about?
So the examples I used were China, Iran, and Russia. And the reason why I use those examples, because the democratic process there either doesn't exist or is extremely faulty to the point that we wouldn't consider it a true democracy. The representation of the people in power do not represent the will of the people. In Germany, there can be a very strong case to link the people to the government. In the US, even though people do see, and it's always good that people kind of see the separation between the government's action and the people who vote, there is a clear link between the people because the people vote for their leadership. Whereas, but in the US and other places, there's a lot of people who vote for a different party that's in power than who vote for the party in power. So there is always a little bit of the society that's out of that. But it is a democratic process. The countries where we make a very key distinction about differentiating between the government and the people is the countries where the people have no right to influence their government via elections. And so that's where it's very key that when we criticize the government that doesn't represent the will of the people.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep, no problem. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, I think I'll take the word here. And as we're gradually wrapping it up, reaching the end of the time slot that we've booked, I have one more question, really, and it's a harmless one. Mm-hmm. Knowing that some people here are pondering the idea of possibly joining the diplomatic service in Germany or the US, how much help has your theater training been in becoming a diplomat?
On learning about policy, nothing. That was all on the job. On learning about how to present yourself, on Zoom, it's a little bit difficult because you can't see body language as well. But it is helping. It's very helpful in presentation of self. It helps you adjust better to a situation. I think it's very helpful in that sense. It also, you develop a lot of confidence from being in the theater. So I think it's very helpful for public engagements. But for policy, not very helpful. You just have to learn as you go. But yeah, I think I really like the American model because I'm American, and also because I think it allows people to decide they want to serve their country in a different way without having the formalized training. And I think it creates a diplomatic corps that's a little bit more agile, a diplomatic corps that can become a little bit more representative of the people. We've had a huge push in the Foreign Service through several fellowships to make sure that we have racial minorities, people from parts of the country that aren't usually represented in the Foreign Service. So some of the Midwest states that we've had a hard time recruiting from there, to make sure that people from those areas, racial minorities, are part of the Foreign Service, so they have their opinions and their expression and their attitudes are expressed in the decision-making process. And I think we're a better Foreign Service when we have more viewpoints, more diverse viewpoints in the room making decisions, because that means that you're not making as many mistakes because you have more people to say, hey, that's groupthink, don't do that. And you're forced to defend yourself and you defend your decisions better when you have more people with diverse opinions. So I think that's a really good thing, and I think that's a model that's possible because of how we do our Foreign Service, and that people like from that study theater can join the Foreign Service. I think it's great.
Yeah, and of course there's the advantage. I mean, the better your rank and file diplomats are, and the more diverse they are, and the more agile they are, the more likely they can actually sort of catch the damage that might be done by the political appointee who's actually the ambassador. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much,
Andy Halus, for being with us tonight. And for those who are only seeing this later, of course, it will be kind of difficult to write a learning log about this. But I'd encourage you to be creative about this one. I mean, we've had a theater man in the show, and you might as well be creative about the learning log that you're responding with. No, so I don't expect a minute by minute sort of account of what happened here tonight. Thank you all. And
thank you so much.
This was it for before Christmas. We'll see you again after Christmas, I hope, at least. Then we'll have the lectures taking place in the lecture hall again, and by our own people, so to speak. So you're a celebrated guest for us tonight. Merry Christmas, I hope, and a Happy New Year also to your husband.
Thank you.
Half of the answer to the question that I had, about the theater was already given by him, which you quoted earlier, that he'd wish you'd be half as diplomatic at home as you can be in the service. Very nice evening that we've had with you, and God bless you all.
It was a pleasure. Be safe and wear your masks.